Hi, everyone. Welcoming you here today for our program on weaving successful partnerships, how funders, intermediaries, and evaluators can collaborate for change. I have a wonderful, very close-knit panel here with me today, and I will introduce them shortly, but I just want to give you a brief overview of how this will all transpire. So first off, I'm Michelle Dilworth. I'm the director of the Regional Office for Candid, which is the newly formed organization that combines GuideStar and Foundation Center. We have a very simple mission to get you the information to do good. So we have a live audience here with us today, but then I know we have many, many more online watching via live stream. So thank you all for being here both in person and online. The way that we're going to do it, we're going to just start with some moderated questions, and then we will open it up for questions for everyone. And so we have a small group here in the room, so we will probably just ask you to stand up and state your question. I'll repeat it so that everyone on the live stream can hear, and then we'll go from there. And those who are watching live stream, you can just use that chat box to ask your question, and we'll be sure to get it up here, and we'll share with the panelists as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. To my right, I have Elizabeth Gonzalez, who is now the Chief Program and Strategy Officer at College Futures. Thank you for being with us. Next to her is Joel Vargas, who is the Vice President of Jobs for the Future. Welcome. And then we have Claire Nolan, who is the co-founder of Engage R&D. And then last but certainly not least, we have Meg Long, who is the President of Equal Measure. Thank you all for being here. So we're here to talk about the study that had been put together regarding what it takes to have this triad relationship between funders, intermediaries, and evaluators. And all of you worked on one of the case studies, one of the examples. And let's start there with that partnership and how it came to be. So I'm going to first start with you, Elizabeth, as the funder of that program, and we're going to be talking about the Linked Learning Regional Hubs of Excellence program that you helped start and how you gathered everyone here today.
Okay, great. Good morning. Oh, let me see if this is on. It should be on. Here. Okay. Yeah, is it? That's fine. It's great. So as Michelle just said, I am Chief Program and Strategy Officer of the College Futures Foundation, and you're probably wondering, well, that's not the same as the funder who was funding the Link Learning Initiative. And so prior to joining the College Futures, I was at the James Irvine Foundation for almost 5 years, and one of our premier initiatives was the Link Learning Initiative, which was aimed at improving the college and career readiness of all low-income high school students in California. And so that was a long-standing, really key premier initiative, multi-million-dollar, almost 10 years. And so you might imagine just an important signature investment that we began as a funder to think, what's the next stage of our role in this work, given that it was picking up steam. So it started off like a lot of other initiatives, some pilots and some, it's a high school reform effort. And so started off as some school districts that we funded, and then we moved into a network of school districts, and then with the regional work said, what's the next stage of scale and how could we actually build more demand? And so when I think about my experience and our experience in that work, it's within that context. So as you hear us talking today, I know for myself as I think about that work within that context, specifically the Link Learning Hubs of Excellence, again, was this regional investment where we were funding, right now it just hit me with four communities, and I know Joel will speak to that as well. So we had 4 communities who some of the districts had been in our portfolio for many years, but again, we were building out a coalition of districts, community colleges, even thinking about CSUs, employers to say, how do we build demand for college and career readiness in communities to serve as a model throughout the state? This was new to us, doing this kind of regional work. So it was new to us. I should say that. And then the other part of it which wasn't as new to us, was saying, how do we structure actually the initiative? So if we're moving from from a school district focus to something that's more multi-sector, how do we want to begin to structure that initiative. And so that's when we reached out to Jobs for the Future, JFF, a longstanding intermediary, and again, Joel will speak to that, to help us think about how we can actually work with the intermediaries. And candidly speaking, as a funder, we weren't going to be doing the direct work. We didn't have the capacity to do that, so we wanted to work with a strong funder. Likewise, we wanted to bring the evaluation from the beginning, in particular because it was going to be new for us, and we really wanted to share our learnings with the field. And so we ran an RFP like many foundations do, and we're lucky enough that two of the firms that applied actually came together, and Megan Claire will speak to that as well. So it was at the time Harder & Company and Equal Measure came together. And so so that was it. We said we want the evaluation from the beginning, we want a strong intermediary, and we want to build out that partnership. That sounds really nice and really clean, and there are a lot of lessons, as is evident by the study, but that was really the genesis. We said, how do we structure that together? And I'll say one thing, and it'll come up again, is we didn't have a clear, or I don't want to say the word clear, but we didn't have a strict theory of change or theory of action, how this was going to be done. And so the partnership amongst the three of us was also critically important as well, was because we ended up doing that together with the sites. So I'll leave it at that because I can talk about this forever, but that was the genesis
Thank you.
for this.
All right, Joel, I'll let you take over from there as the intermediary in this program.
Yes, I played the role of the intermediary organization in this initiative, as we often do. And intermediary, it's a funny. I'll try to define what we did, and that'll give you some sense of our role nationally. JFF, just first of all, is a national organization, over 37 years old. I've been with the organization for 16 years. At the time of this initiative, we actually came out to California to start our West Coast office. And that is because there was a lot of investment at the time going on in collaboratives that were trying to sustain and scale up pathways that connected high school and help those high school students get into college and career starting in their latter years of high school, just as a part of what they did. Linked learning is a premier approach in that arena. And we saw this, and fortunately the Irvine Foundation saw us as a possible resource to help test this notion of picking leading communities to build demand through these collaboratives for more linked learning pathways and graduates. So it's very aligned with the work that we do nationally, which is really all about trying to better align our education and workforce systems for low-income adults and students, and make sure that everyone has an equal shot at economic mobility, and also ensuring that employers get the employees the talent that they need to help the economy thrive. Now, how we do that is we often find ourselves in the positions of working closely with system leaders, foundations, and other investors to design different kinds of solutions, and then to learn about those and to disseminate those learnings so that people who want to do these, if they show some success, they don't have to start from scratch. We do a lot of documentation work. We run a lot of networks nationally. We have been known for starting and promoting and just disseminating, promulgating, if you will, good ideas in the field that have become more commonplace, even though they may have started as these sort of nascent, interesting innovations. And then we also do a lot of policy work as a result of that. So we often find ourselves in the middle, as an intermediary does, with grantees in the field. In this case, the foundation asked us to do some of the grant making with them and to develop an RFP process with them, to do some of the reconnaissance out in the field and due diligence to identify the promising communities where we thought this kind of work could take off. We work with evaluators in different ways, and usually that ends up being a very rewarding kind of relationship. And particularly as I reflect on this initiative, I don't think I've ever learned so much and had so much kind of professional development as a nonprofit leader as a result of being a part of the initiative here. And that's because the foundation and I think our partners really invested the time in that. So I can talk a little bit more about that as we go.
Meg, do you want to give our evaluation
Yeah,
origin story?
so we have a funder, right, that's taking a longstanding investment and taking it to scale regionally. We have a national intermediary that's setting up a West Coast presence that's bringing serious thought leadership, a policy stance, coaching, and doing the grant making. And then, because this is all new, there's a third partner in the mix. And actually, this partner over time turned out to be 3 firms coming together.
That's right.
To provide evaluation support. And this was not a traditional sort of summative impact evaluation, let's be at arm's length for 3-4 years and then tell you what happened. This is very much framed as a developmental evaluation. We're learning as we go, we're pivoting strategy, and I know this is blasphemy to say for some evaluation professionals, but we felt we had a real vested stake in the success of this initiative. So we were not a third-party evaluator, we are a true partner. And I think I'll speak for our partnership as evaluation firms, that the other thing that we really wanted to show through this work for the field is that competitors can really work together to really deepen the learning and evaluation support that you can have as part of a really robust strategy. So that was the third actor, and we were the evaluation crew. Made up of, over time, 3 organizations, Engage, R&D, Equal Measure, and Harder & Company.
Great, thank you for that nice summation. A question just that came up that I think it would be good to get on the table earlier than later is just the idea of time. So you mentioned 3 to 4 years in terms of this. Can you share with us, when did this idea come to you as when we wanted to get this started, and then how did it get kicked off, and then how long was the duration of the whole project?
We can very much tag team on this one, and I'll start us there. So as I was sharing, in 2015, it had already been almost 10 years of our Link Learning portfolio, as we just said, which was a school district based initiative, and we were moving to the regional scale. So we began, I want to say, Joel, the conversations began around 2013, 14 to say what would be planning, how would we start to set this up to move to regional coalition, these regional collaboratives, these hubs of excellence. So we started around late 2013, 2014. But let me then say what happened. At the same time, the state was about to do this huge investment in career pathways, this model of, high school to community college, career pathways. And so that happened at the same time we were developing this regional scale. And the California Career Pathways Initiative was also focused on regional scale. All of this happened at the same time. So to your question around time, we started off by saying, let's start with planning, then we'll move into a 3-year initiative, and then we came into the work and said we have to rethink this because you have these same regions, we're also competing for those statewide dollars. And so we had to think about how do we align those, how do we not become competitive, is there something that we can do as a funder that they can't do with those state dollars? And I'm saying this we're trying to do that intentionally, but we're also a funder that had a set of things that we wanted to accomplish with that work that were aligned to our specific initiative that had particular elements of the approach, of the Link Learning approach. So I will say that was we said, it'll be a 3-year initiative. It did not turn into a 3-year initiative. It turned into it turned into longer to that. I also want to say, and then I'm curious, Joel, how you think about this as well, but we were discussing how at the same time that this was happening, so I've shared with you the Irvine Foundation, what was happening with our initiative. We were moving into thinking about sunsetting it at the same time to think about this new scaled approach. We had the firms that began as 2 partners. Thank you, Meg, for reminding me. Then it turned into the 3 firms for various reasons. And then JFF was building out an office in California. So that was also a reason for us to say we need to think about this differently because we actually want all of us to succeed. We want both the initiative on the ground to succeed, we want these partnerships to come together, and then we want each one of the partners here at the table to succeed. So we need to step back.
Yeah, the sense of the dimension of time, I think we can uniquely comment upon because we were kind of mixed up in both the Career Pathways Trust state investments at the state level, really, but we also researched some of the collaboratives that were seeded through that state investment at the same time as we were supporting the Link Learning Hubs of Excellence. and there was some crossover in those sites. So there were hubs of excellence that had won state dollars for Career Pathways Trust activities. And I would just say, even though those time spans were roughly similar and paralleled each other, the work and the character of the work was so much different, and the pace of it and the pressures, and thus the way people behaved in those partnerships with each other. And I think this was part of the adjustment. I mean, at the time, I think it was fairly conscious, actually, that the Career Pathways Trust, it was kind of a classic grant program, and I paint with a too broad a brush, probably, but often what would happen is, money gets thrown on the table. It needs to be spent like yesterday. You get all the partners that you need who will help you win the grant. You say, well, if you do that, I'll do this for you. It's very transactional. And, the work plans and all of the stuff that comes along with, we need to hit the numbers. We need to check the boxes to show that we did what we said we were going to do with the grant dollars. And it needs to look big, and it needs to look fast. I would actually say, fair enough, our mental model at JFF's of the Linked Learning Hubs of Excellence work probably ran along those lines at the very beginning, and so did our partners out in the field. They thought, we got the work plans, JFF, come on down, we're going to show you how we got the right people at the table, we're going to check those boxes, ready to go. And a turning point in the initiative was, all of us were part of it, when Irvine Foundation said, and Elizabeth specifically said, slow down. This work is about building foundations for sustainable growth. That's how I interpreted it anyway. That changed the whole dynamic of the work we were doing with the hubs versus a lot of the pressures that we saw the same people who were involved in the hubs, experiencing as a part of the Career Pathways Trust. In some ways, you need a little bit of both, and in the best of all worlds, you can work that tension. But having I can tell you from several kinds of experiences, and I'm sure a number of audience members have experienced it, for the most part, big initiatives tend to run, and the time is tight, got to deliver a bunch of things. That dictates how partnerships get formed.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that, Joel. I was really happy that you shared that example, because I was reflecting on how much momentum there was in the state, but also this tremendous amount of growth that JFF was doing, to open and build this office of now quite a significant number of people, and that there really was not a lot of time for pause or reflection to sort through the work that was taking place, some of the both synergies and conflicts between the state investments and the private foundation investments that were being made, and how that was actually playing out locally on the ground for people at times was very confusing. And I think Irvine was wise to give that guidance to slow down. And I think you alluded to this earlier, but to create this space where the team at JFF could take a breath and hear a little bit from folks who were not involved in the day-to-day, but who were going deep at each of the sites on the evaluation team to really listen, understand what was going on, and bring that back to the table. And I think there were things that you guys were seeing in your work, but making that space to reflect on what it meant and how to really support positive progress for students was something that I think we created this very special table together that I think really helped to accelerate and advance the work by actually slowing down.
So I'll just say, typically at the end of a planning phase, the evaluation team expects to roll out a really beautiful evaluation data collection plan. What we rolled out with was, we got to slow down. We have to slow down, and we have to make sure that we pace and create very deliberate reflection moments. And we actually ended up structuring those every 6 months, roughly. And I think, as we'll talk in a minute, that was incredibly additive. But it was a very different timeline and a very different workflow, if you will, than you would typically expect in an initiative like this with a triad of partners.
Thank you for that. So much good information there. It's like, what question am I going to ask now? There's so many good ones. One of the things I thought we might get to, thanks for sharing all that context and background on the project, but going back to the study and things that have surfaced from the study using the linked learning as one of a few examples, was just the idea of the tensions that arise in these types of programs. And Joel, you alluded to some of that. And so just for those of you who have not read the study, you can get it from the link from when you signed up for this program. It's linked there, and I believe that you live stream audience actually have it in the chat box for you to look at. But one of the things, they talked about 5 different common tensions in these types of triad arrangements, and those being power dynamics, clarity of roles, trust, communication, and the idea of impact. So just to get a little further into those, maybe we could start with the first on the idea of power dynamics and how that played out in this triad, starting with what were those things, and if there were any challenges, how were those mitigated, and what advice you would give to others as they're embarking on something so that those challenges or tensions did not arise as they did for you all. Thank you all for being so honest and sharing ahead of time.
There were no tensions.
Pat and I were talking about
Totally.
it.
What power?
Oh, interesting. So maybe
You wanna know?
we'll switch roles.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start from the end there, Meg, if you
Yeah,
and
so
Claire
let me
wanna start.
frame up just because of course there were power tensions and power dynamics. But one thing I just want to sort of take a step back and think about is, in our work, I was flying here from Philadelphia, and I was thinking about all the projects that we have in our portfolio. And of all of them, there's only 2 that I could think of that didn't have this triad. So this kind of relationship between an intermediary and a technical assistant partner, or technical assistance partner, a funder, and an evaluation team is really common. And it's on the rise, especially for national initiatives that are really trying to go deep in place. There was a variety of reasons for that. What I realized, though, is that there's we spend a lot of time finding the right individual partners, right? Getting the right evaluation crew, getting the right intermediary with the expertise, flexibility, policy stance, advocacy stance, et cetera. And then we magically put them in a room and say, okay, guys, good luck. Let's see how this initiative unfolds. So what the origin story of this brief in general was we were like, we really have to be a little more thoughtful about how we structure these partnerships. So, and for those of you that have had a chance to take a look at the brief, there's, I think, a sort of an initial, but I think a really helpful concept of how these relationships are structured. It's on page 5. It sort of talks about the various dimensions, and it goes from sort of the concept of a really powerful funder, where the funder gives resources to the intermediary, to the evaluation partner, and the communities, all the way to a model of a powerful intermediary, where the funder gives resources to the intermediary, who then disperses them. And there's 2 other models in there. So the first thing I wanted to say is power dynamics will show up very differently depending how you structure the partnership. And, power dynamics can be additive because they can add a little urgency, but they can also be really crippling. And one thing you should know is there were some interesting existing and non-existing relationships in this trio, and something to think about when you're designing these kinds of initiatives. The evaluation crew had a pre-existing relationship with Irvine. JFF had a pre-existing relationship with Irvine. JFF and the evaluation crew did not have a pre-existing relationship. And there's also power dynamics that flow with who has control over resources, who has control over communications to the communities. And those are the types of things that we really, really had to work through. But taking all that aside, I think the thing that really helped us think about our power dynamics is we had to really understand, and we were talking about this earlier, we had to sort of really understand what was in it for each of our individual organizations or entities, right? What were the non-negotiables? What was the stake that we had in this work, right? So what was the image that we had to preserve? What was the change strategy that we had to preserve? And getting clarity about that, not just about roles, but getting clarity about sort of what was in it for us individually and collectively really helped. The only other thing I'll add is we established some really good working norms. And one of the first working norms was, we'll do no harm. So if the evaluation team would learn something or was likely to learn something that was potentially dangerous, if you will, to the success of the initiative, it was our responsibility to raise that in a confidential but respectful way. So norms and just understanding what's in it for the individual partners was really important to mitigate some of those power dynamics.
Thank you.
I agree with all of that. I'll name another power dynamic that I'm not sure shows up in the brief as much, but it is something I hearken back to as I was preparing for this, and I don't even know if I've shared this with you or with you. I know. Get ready.
But we love and trust each other, Joel.
I remembered being on a call. I think it was with both of you, and I was still in Boston. And there's power inherently in being an evaluator in any initiative, whether or not you're being funded by whomever, by being judged.
Yeah.
And then also feeling like there's this strange, vague feeling that I have that you know something that I don't, and you're not telling me, and yet you're judging me for what about the things I'm saying or the things that I know and don't know. That took a little time, in any sort of initiative, but particularly in one that was, more in code, I guess, and where we had to, the part of the work was doing the definition. And I really had to get my team, some of whom had been evaluators in their past, who shall go unnamed, but have been fondly remembered and have contributed a lot to this, who had a distrust because they said, no, their job is to judge us, and when we got into a little bit more of a co-construction role around what is the meaning of this work, what is it about, and understanding that our roles in that were, from different perspectives, and we had different roles in the initiative, but yet being able to, a lot of our meetings were about what sense are we making of this work? I think we got into a groove then that was the power dynamics were mitigated in that way. There was still every once in a while where we would come into a meeting and say, we've been noticing this and that, and then Claire would pop out a framework and say, it reminds me of this. And it's like, why didn't you tell us? And of course, it wasn't that way at all. It was just because we were co-constructing, and it was a beautiful thing. So whether or not you knew it, it was beautiful that you didn't say that you knew it, because it gave us a space to sort of design, what this work was about together.
Well, I love that example, Joel, and I remember, developmental evaluation is very different than traditional summative evaluation, which often is coming from that place of judgment, right? Judging the value or the merit of a body of work, whereas the position of developmental evaluators is to really try to support the success and to be a thought partner to those involved in a complex initiative. And I think what was interesting is I remember when we were negotiating that, I think as an evaluator, you always know that dynamic is there, and you're thinking, how am I going to break that down? How am I going to break that down? But it gets very hard in the formality of some of the meetings that you have in these beautiful foundation offices, and so I remember we, would be like, oh, have you guys looked at this framework? Because I think it speaks to, what you are experiencing or could be helpful for what you're trying to achieve. And then I remember we had this period where it was like, does that mean we have to use that framework? And that is now the framework for our work. And then we were like, no, but that was not something that was clear. And we had to actually work through that. We were like bringing forward ideas that were connecting with what all of you were doing, but it wasn't like that then became the frame for the work, right? So that I think was really held by JFF, even though there was a partnership on that, not only with the evaluation crew, but also with the funder.
Just want to add to the point about the different ways that we were all connected prior to that. So I have supported and been part of initiatives in other places that I've worked in philanthropy where it had a very similar structure. I was at a national before, and so again, part of it is that you don't have the capacity, and yet you want to build out a sustainable body of work. And so I had worked with Meg specifically on another like initiative, which had the same structure, an intermediary, an evaluator. And those were some of the pain points. I was thinking of early conversations that we had where I was getting used to the role clarity because of this point around that knowledge is power. Who holds it, who's saying what's happened, what the communities are learning. So my second point around power is we haven't really talked about the communities either, is that we had to hold ourselves to who's speaking on behalf of the communities and where does that touch point happen, and who speaks to that. And so I'm just naming that because that's just in it, especially for a funder, there's always a power dynamic because of dollars. And so you have to figure out how do you structure and seed power. Because you do come in sometimes. We're not in it with you all the time. And I want to give a special shout out to a former colleague of mine at Irvine, Cristina Garcia, who was the senior program officer, we worked really closely with here. I was the portfolio director and she was the lead staff. But Cristina, we would have these conversations like, how do we move back? Because that's the one thing that we can control and that you all build the relationship. And then we would also think like, how are we ensuring that the voice of community is in there? So I want to name that's also part of the power dynamic as well.
Can I just, I'm sorry, you're going to have to reel us back because there's something really important here that is worth stressing as we sort of think about fungibility of these lessons for other initiatives. So I appreciate the shout out to Cristina Garcia, but both Cristina and Elizabeth created a very open and truly modeled open dialogue. And when Elizabeth says that they stepped back, but also had a very sort of regular cadence of stepping back in. Because the alternative is the funder steps way back, right? You build deep relationships here, and then the funder comes in, once a year with a very specific question, and all of a sudden, the power dynamic is sort of, everyone's on pins and needles because we're not sure that we had actually gone in the direction that was intended. So I wanted to underscore that. The other small nuance in other initiatives, as you might think about, is we had a great benefit in that both for the evaluation crew and for JFF, we had one and the same program officer. Sometimes in philanthropy, you have a content program officer, and then you have the measurement, evaluation, and learning program officer. And depending on how the power dynamics play between those two roles within philanthropy, it can definitely affect this triad too. So I won't go into too much detail because it can get complicated quite quickly, but think about, who the point of contact is within philanthropy in this triad as you're thinking about power dynamics.
I just have, I'm sorry, Michelle, one more thing on this, and this built on both your points a bit. I mean, these relationships matter in the triad because they do reverberate to the communities. The way we showed up with each other ended up, which was modeled by the foundation in many ways, and the foundation created a space for that, and then we jumped in and worked and leaned in. But it was felt in the communities as well in terms of how we showed up with them and they showed up with us. It took a little bit of time, but I would say just an example, the meetings went with them, our periodic check-ins with them, reporting, quote unquote, with them, moved from a reporting and, very formal, check the box, to conversations that were rich in learning and also had leaders in those communities being vulnerable with each other in front of us, and asking for help and help of each other, which actually helped to just cut through a lot of the barriers that they had. So that's why it makes a difference, I think, because that ethos does characterize the whole initiative, not just our relationships.
So that's interesting to me. So it seems like that idea of openness and stepping back, stepping in, and creating that trust, which is another one of these barriers, really came top down, right? I hear from all of you saying that it started with the funder and then it trickled down in a way, if I'm hearing that right. So I'm wondering, that seems to be a very important piece of how you relate to community, and I'm wondering if you all have any examples when the funder might not have had that role, but you were still trying to create that community trust. I know that wasn't on our sheet of questions, but to me that was an interesting idea of where does this culture begin, and how do you foster it? And if it's not coming from the funder, which is wonderful that the funder in this environment was that, how does that play out?
You want to go ahead, Claire?
Go ahead, Joel.
Well, whoever it is, someone has to prioritize making room for the conversations and the trust building and the relationship building. So it helps if it's quote unquote funded activity,
Right.
if you will. I mean, really, it can help a lot, but that's not it's as much about mindset, and relationships and past experiences and being attuned to that need. But I mean, I'll be frank. I mean, there are some initiatives that I've been in. It's just, you don't have the room, frankly, or you don't feel you have the room to do that. It's like, I have 2 minutes, not 10 minutes to dedicate to that. And more time, it makes a difference. So that's my view.
Yeah, I would say the funder really plays a critical role in setting that tone. And if that tone is not set there, I would say kind of both of our ethos of our organizations is to try to create more of that learning orientation when we're working in that context. And I think it's possible to do it, but it is much more difficult. And sometimes that happens when the funder is not there. You can kind of create that dynamic, but then it can be dispelled if a funder comes in with asking very different questions that kind of aren't consistent with that learning collaboration. So I think it's possible to create that space, especially if you have ongoing long-term relationships in a community. But I think that's a really critical place for the funder to lean in and to really support and create that.
I will say, if you think about a model that might have a particularly strong intermediary, it could be the role of the intermediary. I think, part of it is we have to unlearn certain habits that we've created maybe inadvertently in the sector. And, this idea of accountability and who am I accountable to plays into this. So, it's hard to be vulnerable if you think that your work will be critiqued or underfunded or unfunded as a result. So I think, if you really think about who has to set the tone of do no harm, somebody, like you said, Joel, somebody has to take that position, right? And somebody has to say, the information that you share with us will not be used against you, it will be used to support you. So I do think, I think depending on the structure, it can be any one of the triad. I think it is most powerful, like you said, Claire, from the funding partner or the investor. It's not always a foundation. But I do think that it is the responsibility of the other partners to make sure that that is clear as well.
Can I add to that too, Michelle? So I was thinking about this other points, right? Power, role, clarity, trust, communications, and impact. I mean, you're probably hearing from us, it's all of these things woven together, right? Our way to kind of mitigate the power. But on this point around impact, and it relates to what you're speaking to, is that one of the things that we did at Irvine was, I named in the beginning the tension of the state coming in, and there was all this, there's going to be more pathways in the communities, we're going to have all of this. Our initiatives, is going to lose, interest. But what ended up happening was it gave us actually space to say, you know what, we're not going to look at this like how many students in Riverside are going to, graduate and go directly to college. Not that that wasn't the long-term goal, but that, that the sort of tyranny of the like direct, student impact that we know takes forever was something we let go. And it was really difficult because what we realized what we were doing was systems change work, right? We were thinking of powers, we were thinking of habits, we were thinking of how do institutions work. We were thinking about dollars, and so we said, you know what, this is about sustainable relationships and that change, because I knew as the funder that we weren't going to be there forever. I knew that there were other dollars that really were kind of direct to districts, that the room that we had was, how do you build out like a real systems change collaborative, knowing that it is really hard work. No one's ever done it. There's more of us, thinking about how do you incent that, how do you build that, and how do you realize you're a player in that. So I just want to note that we had to change the way we were thinking about impact in the community, so that when we left, we're like, it wasn't about whatever initiative we had there. It was, I keep saying Riverside, poor Riverside is thinking, like, why are you calling us out? But they're doing incredible work on college completion. They're reimagining the relationships between the county office of ed, the community college district, the CSU there. And I think it's because in the beginning there was a space to actually have what I thought was difficult conversations. We still have, I know that Irvine still has relationships, and other funders do as well. I know that JFF, I know that you all are doing, work in these communities. So I wanted to complicate that notion of impact, and that as a funder, we had to let go this sort of, the kind of how many students will we, in the next 3 years will graduate. Again, it's not that that's still not the long-term goal. It's just that in systems change work, you have to look for other signals, and you have to actually think about the other kind of impact measures.
Think of the level of internal case making that had to happen to make sustainable relationships to drive change an acceptable outcome for this work. And then think of the exercises that we had to go through together to show that those relationships were in fact changing, and why we assumed that they were going to lead to sustainable change that would have population level outcomes. Right? Like, that was really, and to your earlier point, Joel, about co-creation, I'll use it here. We went through a lot of framework twerking. We had 20,000 frameworks that we iterated on over the course of this initiative. Marty, I hope you're watching.
Credit to Marty
But
Alvarado.
that was the whole thing, right? We didn't come in and say we want an increase in 20% of X, Y, Z, and I need to address these achievement gaps. That actually, we started that way, and then we were like, wait a minute, let's take a step back. So I really appreciate you calling that out, Elizabeth, in terms of sort of resetting the expectations, and I would say right-sizing the expectations, and then the exercises we all had to go through to make sure that we could show progress on those expectations that were right-sized.
And actually communicating that to the community, because they're under pressure every day. They actually have to deliver that as part of their mandates, right? Especially as public institutions or as getting dollars from funders. So to say that to them, like, no, we really mean it. Like, this is about you building out a set of relationships. But because the student outcomes are their rallying cry for them on the ground every day. But I will say that piece of it is there too.
And the leaders in our networks, we were asking them to spend the time to build the relationships that would sustain their work. They had to explain it to their bosses, some of whom are elected officials. And they're on the hook really for saying in 2 years or whatever their term is, here's what we've done. And so the pressures are real in there, and we have to fully appreciate those, even as we understand the importance of creating these spaces.
Yeah, I think I wanted to add too that one of the things that was unique to this initiative, but that is something that many organizations are struggling with, is that, like, really this was this very successful program model and had been for many, many, many years. And the attempt in order to scale that was to actually not have it be a programmatic model, but actually to have it be a systems change, an approach, a set of principles that could be adopted across sectors, as opposed to a program model in a high school. And I think that was very unique in the context of the linked learning field, and perhaps even like anathema, right, to some. And so to help the communities understand that it wasn't just about more students, but this broader adoption of these principles for how folks could work together across sectors, was such a mindset shift, and that it wasn't about student outcomes, but more about that collaboration and way of working that could get to that deeper population level impact. Just when Irvine kind of made that distinction and everyone recalibrated, I think that then went down to the communities, and that was a new way of working for people.
Well, thank you for that. So just within that, there's so many things there where we've touching upon just the trust, the communication, impact, all of those things. But some other things that arose besides those, quote, common tensions that were pointed out in the study were just how important it seemed to be coming in from a learning mindset, that, outputs versus, what is that, and the fact that learning was such a high priority in this initiative. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, maybe from your experience in other types of partnerships, like how important is coming into one of these triads with the idea of learning being one of the higher goals and how to, knowledge dissemination instead of actual, butts in student seat, in chairs. Just wondering in terms of that.
So I just had a little bit of an epiphany when you were asking that question, Michelle, because I actually think that you can, and it's totally legitimate to structure an initiative that is very impact and outcomes focused. But that means that you should probably design your triad differently. So if you are trying to advance a very experimental approach or something that feels very new or developmental or untested, or something where you're trying to implement a very different way of working on a very proven concept, you have to thoughtfully structure this partnership and try to find a way to structure the triad in a way that builds allies, right? And then model that allyhood with communities. So I do think that, I don't want us to come out of this saying you should always, design an initiative for learning, because there are other ways to design social impact and investment strategies. But if you are going to design an initiative for learning, you need to think about who the partners are, how their relationships unfold, what their roles are vis-a-vis one another, what their roles are vis-a-vis the communities with whom they're working, and again, the kinds of values that guide the engagement, and calling out learning as a value from the onset, and then again, modeling that, as Joel and Claire had said, because it is a mindset shift. It's a total mindset shift for us. It's a mindset shift for the communities. Communities have had trauma with evaluators. We've had trauma with evaluators. Communities have had, trauma with funders and maybe even intermediaries. I don't know, but there's some baggage that we all bring to these kinds of initiatives and relationships. So just making sure that we're really clear to say, yes, that may have been how you've experienced evaluate. I'll just pick on evaluator since we are. You may have experienced an evaluation in a certain way. You really need to know and believe that this is different, and we will show you how it's different. We will bring findings to you and help co-construct the analysis with you. We will never come back and say, we had found this, what did you do about it, right? We will take a very different stance in sense making. We will bring a very different lens. Like Claire said, we won't bring a framework and then ask you to adopt it. We'll ask you what resonates within it. So those are all just sort of rules of engagement that one needs to establish early if your partnership is structured for learning. That's one woman's opinion.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I actually, again, to give a shout out to our partners, we co-developed
Yeah.
a framework around cross-sector leadership that grew out of the learnings of this initiative. And I think, I'm going to see if I can remember any of them, but a lot of them do hold lessons for how, I think partnerships can be thoughtful about the kinds of competencies that they need to show up with or develop, including, this, I forget what we called it, but there's this sort of orientation of, it's all about making the team look good, and making, part of that is sometimes showing, giving opportunities to let your partners look good. That it's the classic leading from behind, sorry to use the cliche, but you don't, I say too often in some partnerships you'll show up and it's competitive by nature. I mean, every interaction, every meeting is, it's posturing, it's positioning. It can feel that way. Anyway, it's who's the smartest in the room, because the funder's there and you got, whoever gets the smartest in the room may have the chance for the most money. I mean, sorry to be crass about this, but that's how it goes. So you want to move from the dog and pony show and who's the biggest, smartest person in the room to the partnership, the kind of co-construction. Sometimes that means you step back, help others, look good, and tell the collective story. The other thing is I think it helps when, and this speaks to like the experience with people and relationships, seeing the same organization show up who care about a certain strategy or goal or kind of work, it helps after a while to build that trust, because you say, you're not just here because you're a hired hand. Hate to say it, you know,
Yeah.
not that I've ever seen those, but, you know, who sort of fly by night or whatever,
Yeah.
or you wonder, they've been brought in because there's some theory about how this kind of organization can help with this, advance these goals, and then they go away as soon as the grant money goes away. Yet, those organizations, even though you know that money for this kind of work is not, you know, it's not the sexy thing at the moment anymore in this era, but they keep showing up because we all believe that there's some work to do here. That builds trust.
Meg just whispered something to me that I feel like I have to say. You know, Meg and I have been working on an effort called the Funder and Evaluator Affinity Network that is exactly about not seeing evaluators as vendors or subcontractors, but as Meg said earlier, as allies who are also invested in the social change process. These are the communities we live in. These are the equity issues that we care about. We want to be part of that change process, and what does it look like to be that? So I think there's increasing recognition of the role that evaluators play kind of beyond the subcontractor, so that is music to my ears, Joel, to hear you say that. And I think the other thing I wanted to say that you reference as well is that a lot of times I find that there's competition for like who owns learning. Okay, so is that the intermediaries' role? Is that the evaluators' role? Who does that with communities? Is that the foundation? And I think what we did, and there was some like, wait, whose territory or turf? And we were able to like break that open and say like, we are all learners, and there is work for all of us to do to lift up what we're learning. And to do that and support each other in that process. And when I think about this work and how many briefs and blogs and conference presentations that we put together, and even this one, which is like, we're learning about how we work together. Like, it was so meta, you know. So it's just like the possibilities just really open up when you see everyone as learners and teachers.
Can I add to this? Because I don't want folks to take away too, because it does feel like a privilege to say we could sit back and learn while people are doing work in real time. The reason we're talking about that laughing is because you don't have time to do that, right? But the reason it was really important to us, because I want to go back to this notion of systems change, because if we were only doing very shorter term, how many more students are graduating from X district, you know, enrolling, matriculating to post-secondary, we weren't asking more fundamental questions. Is the system serving students right? If our target is, you know, low income, first generation students in particular communities, and they're not being served right, that was the starting premise for us, was you start from there. And then therefore you ask, how do we learn? We need to learn because we actually need to apply the learning. We need to work differently. We need to actually bring the communities together. We need to bring organizations together. We need to bring this together differently, because if it's just learning for learning's sake but not the application, then it actually isn't knowledge. You're not really doing it toward change. And so we would always that's, to me, always has been the value of working in something like this. And then forcing myself, especially as a funder, being more in community, is thinking about, you know, where's the knowledge, how are folks applying it, and do they have the room to fundamentally ask? I'm like, I actually want to serve students different. I want to design the classroom differently, because that's a fundamental tenet of linked learning, is that we need to reimagine what students are learning and how they learn and what their futures are. And so I want to put a pin in that.
Yeah, I also, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I also, we're sitting up here, you're seeing the product of 4.5 years of working together and the depth of relationships that we established. And with our group here specifically, there's probably 12 or 15 other team members that were part of this. So I want to say, it looks hunky-dory, but, we were laughing before as we were prepping. Those first meetings, it was like, who got to sit next to Joel? Where was Christina and Elizabeth? How were we going to sit in between them? I mean, all those dynamics totally played out. And I remember having conversations about who's going to get to contact the community first. and what is exactly the verbiage that we're going to use, and how do we, norm the words that we use so that we're not misrepresenting to the communities or vice versa. I remember, bringing back some findings from the communities, and we had stripped them of, they were confidential, they were anonymous, and there was a whole debate of, trying to figure out who said what, and then we're like, wait a minute, let's just lift it all up, right? So there were some, and we had to be vigilant about making sure that, we were addressing our dynamics. We all had staff changes internally. We all had to onboard and offboard new partners in communities, in our organizations. So, this is a constant play. But again, I think it's so underinvested in and underthought about because we feel the pressure of the community change, right? We feel the urgency of the issue, that we let a lot of these relational things, and as we were joking, right? Who cares about relationships and trust building? These are such soft terms, and yet, and I said I was going to use this, I'm involved in initiatives right now where we have the most structured, scripted, hyper-choreographed systems, processes, communication flows, merged calendars, templated emails, and we still don't have trust because we just haven't taken the time to build it. So your best choreographed technical fixes are not going to build the kind of trusting relationships and learning disposition that will actually help drive change on the ground.
Thank you so much for that and sharing that, because I think if you look at this panel, you can tell there's deep bonds between them, and obviously great work that was done. And so to hear that is really important. I do want to open it up for questions, so I'm just going to let everyone think about their questions for a minute and ask one more of you all just to start, and we'll see how many questions we get. Or otherwise, I'll just keep asking because I have plenty to do so. But I think for me, again, if we could talk a little bit about that secret sauce, like in more concrete terms of how other people could apply it, that you all have really gelled, you all have come to this place. It was not always like this, we know. And so if you could just lift up what you thought was the most valuable to create this sense of community amongst each other and trust and this idea of shared learning.
Joel, you've got secret sauce.
So secrets. I don't know if it's a secret sauce. It may be a list of ingredients that somehow may or may not come together well, just like most of my recipes. You can structure and structure is important. So and time, tone setting. We talked about some of this. Structures and protocols do actually help to make sure that. We had a group of incredible. What did we have? A team of 20 or something. But we created spaces for them. From the most junior, although we had some pretty senior people on this, but everybody had a voice, and they all contributed, and that's because I think you all, you would set agendas with us that were just terrifically inclusive. But at the end of the day, the stuff that made the most difference probably had to do with, and you couldn't have one without the other, right? You could be afraid, but you had tougher conversations. Let me just, that didn't feel so good, or this feels funny. Let me just call that out. There may be a little role definition thing that we have to talk through. And I think I'd like to say, I know Elizabeth modeled it, Christina modeled it. We all tried, we did that with each other. I think we made an effort, weren't always perfect, but the rest of our team members had that culture when we were at our best. Wasn't always perfect, but I think I had more of those moments than I had in any other initiative, where we were able to have that kind of honest conversation, and it just cuts through. You realize that could have really been a barrier to the work, because we weren't really communicating.
I'm going to sound like a total funder, but I will make the case for structure, just because it's gonna become too people dependent, and a lot of this is, right? You're super lucky when you gel, when you have 10 years of experience with one another. But I want to give you all credit for that. I mean, when we mean structure, Michelle, we were really clear at the beginning, and I would say structure and adaptation. So we were really clear the kind of connections we needed to have as of both, so we were going to have calls between the funder, the evaluator, and the intermediary, and we're going to cover these kinds of things. you know, role clarity, who's talking to the community. Again, it was gray at times, but we structured it. It was like, this is what these calls are for. Then the every was it beginning quarterly, then it was every 6 months? I'm trying to
At
remember.
planning, it was quarterly.
Yeah, quarterly, these reflection sessions, and they were agendized, but not in that linear way. It was like, we're gonna try to cover these 3 things, and these will be the principles by which we talk about how communities are doing around leadership or, you know, post-secondary. And I'm just thinking, there was structure. There was, okay, so then every 6 months we come together, and that was an expectation about the kind of depth that you were going to do. And then it evolved, and we said, does this still work? And I remember when the senior program officer, when Christina stepped away from some of the calls, she's like, I'm not gonna be on those anymore. They have to build those. They have to continue to have the communication flow. So I just wanna name that I do think you have to be intentional in how you structure it, because then the soft stuff can't come through if you just rely on people to do it.
Yeah. Claire, what's your secret sauce?
I absolutely agree that the structure is critical, and it made me think of another initiative that I'm part of now, where it's like, we just need a standing call. Like, we just need a standing call, we need a standing call, we need a standing call. And it's amazing, sometimes people don't, they're busy, they have too many standing calls, but you do need that space to talk with one another and work things out. And then, you know, I will say, you know, I do think there is something about making time to get to know one another as individual human beings beyond the professional hats that we wear. And I do remember there was a critical moment where there was just quite a bit of tension underway early on. And Christina Garcia said, you know, I think we need to have dinner and drinks the evening before the next learning session.
Yeah.
And that opened up so much. I mean, it was just a very like innocent, evening in Oakland, but it was much more like, oh, you live here, you know that person, we've been doing work in the same city. You know, people were able to make all of these connections that I think just when we showed up the next day, it just made it easier. I think, Joel, you know, like you build relationship when you have those tough conversations, but in order to have those tough conversations, it just helps to like know and appreciate one another as human beings.
Yeah, I will, absolutely, I think that's true. And like an evaluator, well, you spoke as a funder. As an evaluator, I'd like to introduce a framework. No, I'm just kidding. But I do think about the multiple levels of relationship building. So yes, individual, person to person, team to team, organization to organization, with and towards community. So, you know, all of those levels required some attention and cultivation. And I will say, I actually think the secret sauce is Joel Vargas, because he is hysterical and would always drop the funniest comment in the middle of the tensest, most head-exploding discussion. And that's all we remember. So we have Scooby snacks. Again, we have framework twerking. We actually had in our closing event, we had, was it Jeopardy? We played Jeopardy, where we actually, you know, one of the categories was Joelisms. I mean, so the dimension here is it's really hard and pressing and urgent work, and you need to meet it with that level of urgency and attention. And you also have to have somebody like Joel that can dissipate tension with a joke.
Got to laugh and play a little.
That's right. That's right.
Great. So I'm just going to ask anyone here in the room, if you all have any questions, just please raise your hand and we can take them. And if there's anyone online, let me know. Okay, we'll start here in the room.
Thank you all so much. Super interesting. I have many notes. And I think, Elizabeth, you spoke some about, when earlier mentioned the 5 common tensions. One of them was the idea of impact, and I think you spoke some, maybe this team spoke. Oh, great. I think you spoke some to that, but I'm wondering if everyone else could share a little bit about that tension around the idea of impact for this initiative.
I mean, I alluded to it somewhat early on, and I'll elucidate a little as much as I can remember that far back. But, I remember a lot of sessions where even our mental model at JFF was, we have to help our grantees come up with metrics of success. What is success? That was that first year. What does that look like? And we had been co-designing this up to that point for, at least a year, and still that was the mental model. And, you know, I mean, Christina and Elizabeth coached us, and even, you know, we had a tough call with Christina, who said, you know, guys, that was just a weird meeting, and in some ways, I don't think that's what this work is about. And that kind of came hand in hand with the slow down conversation, because in a sense, what we were in danger of doing was, you know, pushing too hard on the things that really were not the focus of what the work should be in that 3-year period, which was more about foundation building of those, you know, regional collaboratives and their relationships and their competencies, the way they work together. That was a much different kind of work. And when we finally, that took a little bit of pressure off. It put other kinds of pressure on, because as we talked about, it's really hard to say that's what the work is about. And these elected leaders down in the communities are going, and not to mention, you know, anyone's bosses, right? They're sort of saying, what are you doing? Going to those meetings? It's, oh, that sounds very nice. You know, how does that connect to impact? And so you do have to tell a story of, you know, I would say one thing of how, a credible story about how this will lead to more sustained, scalable change that will have a positive impact on the people who you care about as an organization, at the center of your mission. You know, at the same time that you have to create the space for this kind of trust building, and then also along the way being really tactical, frankly, about showing quick wins of here's what it looks like to get success from collaborating in this way, and telling that story and making sure it's really clear to folks so that you create more running room for the leaders in those communities to keep building, not just doing all the time.
Yeah, I've been trying to extrapolate from this initiative into other work a lot. So maybe not specific to this initiative, but here's what I've been noodling on a bit, and it's this idea of embracing emergence. So, you know, I don't think there's a philanthropy or an intermediary or even an evaluator out there that doesn't want to set sort of a direction, right? What I often call the true north, right? Where we want to head. We had a true north, right? We had to improve the pathways and the conditions for students in California to make it through high school, into post-secondary, into wage-earning potential careers, right? So that's our true north. Then there was a little bit of sort of soul setting around how would we know that we're going to get to our true north in 3 years, right? So that's where we got to that creating conditions for relationships and partnerships, right, that we think will set up sort of policy and practice change that will help us get there. I think that in this co-learning design and then this idea of embracing emergence, if you set the true north, then you need to let community, intermediaries, other partners say, how are we going to get there, right? And how will we know that we're making progress? And I think generally as a sector, we create great risks by saying these are the milestones that we're going to hit on the pathway, right? So what this initiative specifically created was, here's our vision for where we want to head. Here's an idea of where we think we can get in 3.5, 4 years. And then partners on the ground, community members on the ground, right? Critical stakeholders, tell us what you think is feasible. And that was part of, I think, Joel alluded to these reflection conversations with community members. They helped set realistic goals, expectations, and milestones that then we said, yes, taken together, these are going to tell us that we're on the right path to creating those conditions. So I just encourage us to think about this idea of emergence. Set the true north, set the direction, and let those with the greatest knowledge, which in this case were the community members, set the milestones.
Great. All right, I'll move on to the next question. Hold on one second.
Hi, yeah, really great discussion, amazing program. As you can hear, I'm from the UK, so I'm here learning. I actually wanted to pick up on your point, really. I guess one of the things I'm really interested in, having been involved in partnerships like this, played the role of the evaluator, the intermediary, and the funder, is just sometimes we can miss the role of the target population, the community that we're trying to serve, especially in the design and setting the vision of the work.
Yes.
So I guess my question is just, how much of a role did either the frontline population or the target population play in setting that vision, informing the work, and going forward, or if you were to repeat this again, how would you go about building that in? And I ask that question because I think sometimes these things can grow in such a way that it ends up being about moving the pieces of an archaic system that has kind of emerged over time, rather than really tapping in to what people need on the ground and building that way. So just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Elizabeth, go.
If I had to do it all over again, because I think we learned that after that, especially the first 2 years, starting with Joel and then with Claire and Meg, is that I would have started that as a starting principle from the beginning, because I think, Meg, you said it nicely to me, and that was part of the secret sauce, was hold a vision, but don't fill it in. The challenge is, even in community, sometimes you need help filling it in too, because it is, you're
Yes.
moving a system that is so rooted in what is. That said, I do think I would have just just made the time for that in the beginning to say the design phase isn't actually just us right-sizing, it's actually including them.
Yeah.
I think we did that over time, but I'll just own that from where I
Yeah.
am sitting, given the power that we had.
Yeah.
I would have done that from the beginning.
I agree, and actually, Meg, I loved what you said. I was like,
Yeah.
drop the mic on that. That's,
Yeah.
but it was like retrospectively that became coherent. But I think
Yes,
like as we were living into it, it wasn't so much. And I just want to second, Elizabeth, what you said, and just comparing to other initiatives that I've been involved in that are trying to move population level outcomes. I have seen ones that have done that. I have seen ones that have not. And I think that when the funders, sets a clear goal, communities come to the resources because they share that goal, but they are part of identifying how to get there, what the conditions are locally that's needed. But when they have some pushing and some support from folks that have seen it done elsewhere, like, to me, that is when you see those population level outcomes move.
Great. I'm going to come to the back because I know we have a question in the room and then also a live stream on, so we'll start in the room.
Thanks. That was a great discussion, and I've learned a lot listening to all of you. I was wondering if you made, either in this partnership or others, the attempt to include the private sector or corporate partners, especially as it relates to linked learning and other things, or was that just a step beyond what the scope of this particular initiative was? And then, if so, how the dynamic would have changed with those partners at the table?
So I'll start. So one of the key elements of the linked learning approach, right? So it's A through G, which is our standards, right, for getting into the CSU or the UC. So our A through G college going standards, integrating it with career, technical, and education. So a technical coursework, work-based learning. So opportunities for young people to actually job shadow, and then the gold standard of a paid internship, and then holistic student supports. So as you might imagine, employers and industry were a key part of the work-based learning in particular, both as a partner in providing work-based learning opportunities in districts around the state, as well as part of that table of building of demand. They're also being a voice that said, we need, this is a pipeline investment. We need, the future workers in California we need them. So I say all that it was built into the approach, but it was also really difficult because and Mrs. Wall, I'll hand it over, for us in the hubs of excellence work and moving to these regional collaboratives, the main players were education folks. They speak the same language, lots of patience for the gray and the detail and the minutia of doing the work to serve students. That's just not the language that employers come into. And so I would say, and I still don't know what the secret magic of keeping them there. That doesn't mean there weren't amazing champions throughout in places. Who have stuck in there, but what I have found is that communities figure out really strategically when to bring them in when there are decisions to be made. Like, we need these number of internships, or we need employers to show up at these events for us. So I'm just doing a quick and dirty, and the answer is, but there's something about figuring out the shared, a kind of language between private and the public sector, because that's just the hardest. And so, for the private sector, they would say to us, I don't have time to sit here in this meeting. I need to know. And we could all have an opinion on that, but that's just the reality. So I'm going to hand it off to someone else after that.
Joel, do you have?
It's really hard.
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard. I think we're just at the edge of our understanding about it, and JFF, we're trying to work. Maybe not. I mean, within the initiative, absolutely what Elizabeth said, and you made all the points I would have made. I think we're increasingly learning that when employers see the stake in this and they lead, which is hard for them to do because they, in some ways, their incentives are that they don't have to.
That's right.
But there are some enlightened employers, I'm not going to call out different ones, but there are some enlightened employers, including some that worked within this initiative, because it made all of the difference for them to sort of set the table. And I think it did have something to do, which is a power dynamic of its own. Like, I'm not going to all these endless meetings of these educators who don't understand what my needs are. But they had to have certainly an ethos of partnership as well in order to get anything done. So I would say shifting, if you can find those employers who own the issue, there's more of a chance of creating more of these kinds of successful approaches that young people need. I don't know, introducing it into this dynamic, I don't have a frame for that. I'm not sure if that was your question, but employers were involved in this initiative. On the community level. Yeah.
I mean, I can extrapolate to, sort of when you think about corporate philanthropy or, the business sector sort of getting involved on social change issues. And there's a couple of things that come to mind. Number one, this idea, inclusion doesn't mean including everyone in exactly the same way, right? Inclusion is including people in the way that they will bring their expertise and the greatest value, both for them and to the effort, right? So you need to know how to tap certain types of stakeholders and partners, in varied ways. The second, though, is, I said we had to know what was at stake for each of our organizations, right? Building an identity, trying to take on sort of a field change, scaling a strategy. When thinking about either corporate philanthropy or the business community, corporate partners, I think it's really worth trying to really understand what's at stake for them. Do they need brand recognition? Do they need are they trying to meet a skills gap? What is it that's bringing them into the fold? And again, for philanthropy, for corporate philanthropy, that might be more volunteers and, visibility of their logo, right? And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But you have to find a way to engage those partners in a way that's meaningful and create that right space for them. So this is a little bit, different than this partnership, but, if we had a corporate funder sitting at the table, we would be very sensitive to what is at stake for them and how do we make sure we are allies to them, right? So this idea of allyhood shows up again.
Thank you for that. We do have one question online that I'll share. It's from Mark Johnson Lewis, who says, hi to you, Meg. And his question is, one, you created this partnership intentionally, paying attention to the who and the what's. Any advice for someone trying to apply your framework to a pre-existing partnership with all its dysfunctions, in parentheses? Go for it.
I wish we knew what they were.
That's a $1.5 million contract coming our way, I think. No, just kidding.
Well, I think one of the reasons we put out this guide was that we really saw a gap in the field that, as Meg said, there are so many of these, and we did, I think we had reflected wow, we're in this all the time. We've never seen a guide that addressed that. And so I think we put out the guide with the idea that folks who are setting these up or who were in them, could use it. So one idea would be even to take some existing partners and use this as a pre-read and then facilitate a joint conversation to say, where are we, doing great, and what are some of the assets that we have at the table, and where might we need to do a little more work with one another if we really want this to be as powerful and as impactful as we want it to be. And I would suggest, really, thinking about who facilitates that meeting and what tone you're setting in the process. But I do think that was the intent of putting this guide out, was to provide support for those who are in these partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. Even as a first step, trying to do a self-assessment around what kind of partnership structure you have, right? Whether it's a powerful funder, shared power, powerful intermediary, or some other infrastructure. And there are some really, it's funny when you sort of produce something and then you don't read it for a while and you come back to it, and it's always nice to be like, wow, this really still holds. But there's actually some really nice questions in the guide that I think could be really helpful just as a meeting, a single, 20-minute reflection conversation in a standing meeting.
I'm sorry, do we have to? Okay. I have a little bit more of a subterranean response to this, which is,
Scooby snacks.
to get out on a limb. I mean, sometimes I think you just have to find like-minded people who see the issue, who see the dysfunction, and who can be part of the solution. And it's a slow route, but building on this idea of coalitions of the willing. And creating small examples of why you get a greater impact if you work together in a more functional way that you can point to. And it helps, obviously, if there are folks who have more power and are modeling that, it will have more of an impact more quickly. But it can start at any level. And that's, so I guess I would be talking about a slow cultural shift. Assuming you can make that happen, that's one small thing that you can start with.
Great. I guess one of the questions I have relating to that too is just that we've really talked a lot about the linked learning model, and we know that there are other models out there. And, I just want to make sure we're not missing anything in terms of how that is. I think there seems to be common themes among them. One is, creating good culture amongst all of the partners, but I'm wondering if we could look maybe just really briefly in the small time we have left at how this might play out in a different type of structure. So, as you pointed out, Meg, there are 4 different ways that these types of partnerships are structured, and one with a very strong funder, and then 2 sort of blended ideas, which is what this linked learning structure was, and then also an intermediary playing that really strong funder role. And just so that even though we love to lift up this particular one because it seems so successful, if there are any lessons learned in other ones that you've done that might not follow the same type of model.
There are those 4 iterations in the guide, and then I think one of the case examples that Equal Measure and JFF involved is they can even become much more complex than that, where it's not just 3 partners, but I think we've been involved in efforts that might have 8 intermediary partners at the table. I know that sounds silly, but you have the comms folks, you've got the TA folks, the strategies. I mean, there's just so many types of supports that get brought to the table. And so I think one consideration that I don't think we talk a lot about in the guide, but based on other experiences that we've had, is thinking about the maturation of these partnerships over time, and that it is really early on. It's very important to make this investment in bringing things together, and then as things mature, configurations might get smaller in terms of who is less central to the strategy and more core. And so anyways, things do evolve, and there is a life cycle, I think, to these types of partnerships that I don't think is really addressed there.
Yeah, I think that's 2.0 of our brief, because I think that's exactly right. And I actually think it's folly not to modify the triad relationship in a very mature initiative. You have to be always adapting your structure. But to your question, Michelle, I think, regardless of the structure, I think there's a few functions that probably need to get hashed out. One of them is related to who sets and refines the strategy and who makes that ultimate decision. That could fall on an intermediary. A very strong intermediary can have a very strong point of view about a certain strategy, right? It could be deeply influenced by an evaluation partner. It could be driven by a funder. But I think really being clear of who makes the final decision. Input is one thing, but who makes the final decision on strategic pivots and using what information and when is really important. The second one that I think we buried a little bit in this brief, but Joel, you brought it up, or maybe it was you, Claire, or maybe Elizabeth. Too many brilliant people here to remember who said it, but it's this idea of who owns and distributes the knowledge. Because, if you have if your intermediary is in a strong advocacy position, they probably need to own and distribute that knowledge in that position, right? And you might, to the earlier question about, corporations or sort of for-profit partners, they might not be the ones that want to own the knowledge or lead with it because it's risky for them, right? So really being clear about who is going to lead the dissemination of knowledge, not who owns it, because we know that really communities own the knowledge, but right, who disseminates the knowledge, who pushes it out there, is a consideration that needs to, I think, get talked through. We have produced a lot together, and we early on determined that we would always do it together, and we would always do it in a coordinated fashion because we all felt we had audiences that we needed to reach with the lessons learned. So strategy, and I think sort of communications or thought leadership are two things that I think really need to get hashed out.
And I would actually add that question about like the role of community in all of this. Oh, sorry. No, good. We're on the same. Yeah, I think that is an underdeveloped aspect of the guide, honestly, and I think it is something that is very tough for people to figure out how to negotiate.
Yeah.
Who is playing what role and what the community's role is. And so I just really appreciated that question. I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to figure out what is that balance of power.
I would say to, yes, to everything that has been said, and I appreciate the patience you had because we were using our glue in this, in this panel is having gone through one of these constructs, right, through an initiative, a longstanding initiative, but hope that there were some nuggets in there that apply throughout. Because I think that, I think as you said this, Claire, it depends on what, I will say, I'm gonna speak for a funder, because a funder is usually starting this, is funding this, but if you're a good one, you're doing it in partnership as you design. You have to decide what you're trying to change, to your point, Meg, what's the strategy for that? And you decide what your best positioning is, because if you're honest, you'll decide, you know what, we don't have a good advocacy voice. Sometimes we do, but in this case, we need to step back and need to bring someone forward. Right. So I do think when we talk about role clarity, it isn't just the kind of transaction or tactical, it's like who's positioned better to disseminate the knowledge, to make those strategy changes. So just adding a little nuance to your point, Meg, which is like, those are decisions that have to get made and may evolve over time. But I think as a funder, depending on that configuration, and to your point, Claire, it sort of changes. I do think you should attach it as to what is the aim of this initiative and what's the aim after the initiative? What do you hope you get out of it? Because then you might position the partners' voices differently.
Just one other very small, I know we're running out of time, but since Mark had asked that question, that was actually one of the first initiatives that I was ever involved in that had this triad. And that was 16 years ago. But this point about judgment, making really clear about if there is judgment, who's making judgments about whom and for what purposes. And I think, judgment happens not just by evaluators, but by all partners. I think that's something that needs to be discussed early on, no matter what the structure is.
Great. We have 1 minute left, and so just want to ask one more question. If you would just lift up the one thing you feel like you learned out of this partnership that you think everyone should know. I mean, we certainly talked about a lot, but what was the most important thing to you in this partnership? Sorry. Joel is always asked upon.
How to tell good jokes. The power of a good joke. I'll go back to a theme. The structure, the clarity about the goals, and the tone. That makes a huge difference in how you partner towards a goal.
Thank you.
Adaptation, adaptability. You have to evolve as the work does.
That's good.
I would say learning as strategy.
And I just say being deliberate about these kinds of relationships as part of the strategy.
Great. So we'll end there. So all of you in the room, there is a survey. It would be great if you could fill that out, and we'll be sending it out to the live stream audience as well. Thank you all for being here and learning along with us, and hope you all have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.